How can I possibly describe the Zodiac in just 1 hour? There's no way. There's just no way. Over the last week, I have sat here and watched various documentaries on the case. I've done some reading. Some documentaries were confirmed because they had the involvement of the actual detectives and the San Francisco Chronicle and people that were involved in what went on during that time period. And then some of the documentaries were flat out just reaching a little too speculative.
And over the years, many people have come forward claiming to know who the Zodiac killer was. Most notably, in 2007, a man pointed fingers at his stepfather, Jack Torrance, who the FBI actually tried at one point to DNA match with evidence left by the killer. Then there was a woman in 2008 who claimed her father, Guyward Hendrickson, was the actual Zodiac killer and said that she was with him for 2 of the murders. And then in 2014, a man published a book where he claims his search for his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., led him to believe that Best was the Zodiac.
I then went down into the Wikipedia tunnel. I got lost, found my way out. And so now I look on this list of these possible suspects after this, 50-something years later, and I'm just, what? Did you guys know that there is a site called ZodiacKiller.com? It's a legitimate site where many of the sleuthers, they come together, lots of speculation. And I have to tell you guys, you could sit here for weeks looking through these items and it's just wow. So in all that, I guess it's kind of redundant that I'm sitting here doing a video on the Zodiac knowing that there's already tons of information out there. I mean, do we really need to revamp it? But for the sake of my community, I did say I was going to do something a little different for the Halloween season. So let's get to it. briefly. We're going to touch on the different incidents and when they occurred.
Zodiac boasted of killing 37 people. Most investigators say they're convinced of only 5. A teenage couple shot to death on their first date parked on a remote road outside Vallejo. The next year, 2 miles away, he used a different gun to kill a woman and seriously injure her boyfriend. Later that month in 1969, the Zodiac sent his first letters to newspapers claiming responsibility. Then, less than 3 months later, the Zodiac moved north to Lake Berryessa. Donning a costume complete with an executioner's hood, he slashed a young couple, once again killing the woman, injuring the man. In October 1969, the Zodiac moved to San Francisco, killing a cab driver with a gunshot to the head. The killer cut off a piece of the cabbie's bloody shirt, then sent it to the Chronicle. Police put out these composite sketches, but witnesses later said they didn't look much like the killer.
I'm going to tell you what started me on this little journey. It was the latest Netflix series that just came out regarding the Zodiac. I guess you could say it was good enough to where it got my mind spinning and me thinking, and I'm like, you know what? I think this guy did it. I think this is the one. Could they have finally solved it after all this time? So I thought I'd just tell you guys a little bit about this documentary, why it drew me in. If you haven't seen it, I'll try to keep you up to date as to what I saw so that you're not lost in all of this. And then we'll just move forward with the rest if we have time. How about that? So this documentary surrounds, really 5 characters. You have the suspect himself, a mother, and her 3 older children were the main ones in all of this. I think she has more than 3. The children's names were David, Don, and Connie Seawater. So there was a man in their life who worked at a school. I think he worked at their school, actually. And at some point, he befriends their mother. This guy did a lot of activities with her children. He would take them places. He would, just as if he was their father. And she would let him go off with this guy. Okay? Yes, it's going there. I'm not allowed to use the word. I'm going to try to avoid the word that you're all thinking. But we'll see. I think I can use the word predator. I think that's YouTube legal. So he finds a woman who has a lot of kids. No man in their life, and he comes in and he plays daddy. He took them on outings. These kids explain their childhood with this man. It's like he took them to some of the best things that ever happened in their childhood, and that's the scary and sad part about all this. I guess there was some hanky-panky going on with mom. Not really positive. One of the younger children thought they saw them go into the bedroom at night. I don't know. Anyway, the crazy thing about all of this is that through all these activities and growing up with this man right there in their life, he became their father figure because their father was not in the picture. They looked up to him, they trusted him, but different things started happening. There were some blanks, like they couldn't fill in some timelines in their childhood, but they never talked to each other about it. Now, I know I'm going to mess up telling you guys this story because it's such a long story. It took him like 2 episodes just to tell the whole story. In these outings that this man would take these kids off in, apparently he was drugging them. Not all of them. Sometimes it was all of them. Sometimes it was just one of them. And he was taking advantage of the daughter. Okay? Well, eventually, this man gets arrested because, like I said, at the time he worked at the school, and apparently there were some students who reported him doing things that he wasn't supposed to be doing. He loses his job at the school, and of course he goes off to jail. This man's name is Arthur Lee Allen.
On his birthday in 1968, Allen's mother gave him a Zodiac watch like this. 2 days later, the Zodiac killed his first known victim.
He's behind bars for 4 years. And this is very important because during those same 4 years, those are the 4 years that the Zodiac went quiet. See, he was writing all those letters, and then all of a sudden they didn't hear from him, and they thought maybe he passed away. They weren't sure. And then he starts up again 4 years later. Now, yes, I'm going to get to the Zodiac story, but this is kind of like I'm taking you outside and going into the Zodiac story, okay? When he gets out of prison, he moves in with his mom. He ends up having back and forth contact with his family still over the years. Apparently, him and the mother were writing various letters, always stayed in touch, and the kids would call on him. It was like calling an uncle and staying in touch with an uncle. It was that kind of thing. All right, you guys remember the movie The Zodiac? It was with Jake Gyllenhaal, Robert Downey Jr., and Mark Ruffalo. 3 of my favorites. So, Jake Gyllenhaal plays the cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle in the movie The Zodiac. All the characters they play were real-life characters, okay? His real-life character ends up writing the book on the Zodiac. It's probably one of the best ones out there about the whole thing, because he was literally there at the Chronicle when all this was going down, and he had a lot of interaction with the detectives at the time. And he could never let it go. He wanted Paul Avery, who was the main writer at the San Francisco Chronicle. Do you guys remember Patty Hearst? He ended up covering that thoroughly, and he wrote a book on the side about her. And I'm kind of wondering if his book was turned into the TV movie. So Paul Avery, he was a heavy drinker. Because of some things that went on with the Zodiac, he ended up leaving the Chronicle. And I don't remember if he was fired or if he just left. But anyway, Jake Gyllenhaal's character goes to him and says, "You should write this book." And he's like, "No way, I'm out. I'm done." So Jake Gyllenhaal says, "All right, well, I'm going to do it myself, I guess." So he literally eats, breathes, and lives the research on this book for the longest time.
Robert Graysmith, a political cartoonist at the Chronicle during the killings, wrote the definitive study on the Zodiac. The book sold more than 3 million copies.
The only stipulation that the detectives had with him when they agreed to help him with some information in writing the book was that he could not use their main suspect's name in the book. And their main suspect at the time was Arthur Lee Allen. So he had to use a made-up name for the suspect, right? So it's 35 years later, this book comes out. And when it comes out, somehow or another, people find out that it's Arthur Lee Allen who is the main suspect. Instead of just laying low and letting this all go, he does this media tour around town. I'm exaggerating.
His name is Arthur Lee Allen, and more than 35 years after the notorious Zodiac killer terrorized Northern California, he's still considered the prime suspect.
About the only way the heat will stop is if I die, that'll cure it for me, or if Zodiac himself confesses.
Arthur Lee Allen, convicted child molester, highly intelligent, a hulking man, 6 feet, 250 pounds at the time of the killings. I interviewed Lee Allen, as he called himself, back in 1991 in the basement apartment under the house where he was raised in Vallejo.
They haven't arrested me because they can't prove a thing. I'm not the damn Zodiac.
In that rare interview that lasted several hours, Allen showed me where 9 months earlier police said they found pipe bombs when they searched his house for the first time.
Under the house somewhere, and I don't know where.
Oh, you're not sure where?
No.
Allen said an ex-con friend had asked to store some things, he didn't ask what, in the crawl space under the house a decade earlier.
This has been so rotten and miserable and terrible, and again, the bad thing about it is that I haven't deserved any of it. And he's just about as vicious as I am.
Allen says a friend of his brother led police to him early on, saying Allen liked the book The Most Dangerous Game in the 11th grade, a phrase Zodiac used in his letters.
Well, he built this into something much, much grander, and remembered other conversations that we didn't have, and figured, well, I must be the Zodiac. A whole lot of heat on the police to get this maniac, this lunatic.
At one point in time, they ended up searching his home, and when they did, they found a lot of bomb-making material. They found various items.
Police also said they found a typewriter similar to the one Zodiac sometimes used, and a diagram of a bomb similar to the one in this original Zodiac letter.
He said he didn't have any idea why they would have found that stuff. In fact, some people had been living in the house, they had been renting the house out, they had tenants, and it could have belonged to them. There was no way for them to connect him to the murders. It ended up to where it was all speculation. They met with him and interviewed him several times. When he died in 1992, they were still in the process of interviewing him.
Who is the Zodiac?
Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac killer.
Now, at this point, the daughter, she's 40 years old, Connie, while he's fighting cancer, doesn't have a lot of time left to live, her children, they all go out on this boat together. I think she, at the point at that time, she already had like a grown daughter. They all go out on the sailboat with him together. And she said that there was this one time when she was little that they went out on the sailboat, just the two of them alone. And she remembers asking him on that outing if he was the Zodiac. She doesn't remember how it came to be that they got into that discussion, but for some reason, she asked him that. And his reply was, well, if I am, I'd have to kill you. And then they both laughed about it. Another thing to note in this documentary is that the Seawater kids, even after they were grown adults, they still referred to him as Mr. Allen. So by 1991, the Seawater kids, they were adults. And the daughter had reconnected with him again, said, hey, how are you doing? They never believed he was guilty. In fact, most of it, the mother knew what was going on with him being in jail. The kids did not. They thought he was just away somewhere. They would all touch base with phone calls every now and then. And he called her one night when she was living in New York, and he said, are you okay? And she goes, yeah, I'm fine. And he goes, okay, good drugs. And she didn't know what he meant by that. And she thought because he was on dialysis, fighting cancer, that he meant the drugs that he was taking. Not long after, he gives her his sailboat, just gives it to her. Now, the mother kept a lot from the kids in all of this. I don't know if she knew he was the Zodiac or if she had suspicions, but she definitely knew a lot more than the kids did. So in 1992, she reached out to her oldest son because he had kind of become estranged with everybody over Allen. There was something about it, everything that was going on, that he just didn't feel right about. And the mother said, look, will you just reach out to him and say your last words with him? So he's 40 years old now, the brother is. So he calls him. And while they're on the phone, Allen starts sobbing. And he ends up admitting to him he had drugged all of them at one point, and that he had been taking advantage of his sister for many years. During that whole conversation, he flat out asked Allen if he was the Zodiac killer. And Allen just kept crying, but in a weak voice, he said, yes, it was me. So after that conversation, he immediately calls the police department. He calls his siblings. He's like, you guys need to know what happened. You need to understand this. He said nobody would believe him. It actually caused a problem with their relationship. They didn't talk for some time. And the mom treated it like it was all a joke. She's like, she's laughing it off. She's like, you're crazy. He's like, Mom, I'm telling you what he told me. And then he said her voice changed. She told him, don't you ever tell anyone. Don't you ever repeat to anyone what he said to you. He was basically telling her, like, Mom, you've got a lot of explaining to do. And she said, look, when I die, I have a box that I've left for you that will explain everything. But you cannot open that box until I die. Anyway, this was a great documentary because it really kept you enthralled as to, oh gosh, now the mom knows more and there's a box, and when are we going to open the box? And
are you the Zodiac killer?
There would be nothing farther from my mind. No, I'm most certainly not the Zodiac killer.
The killer never confessed, and 15 years ago, Arthur Lee Allen died at age 58. But the heat hasn't stopped.
The greatest unsolved mystery of the 20th century.
This particular documentary says he died of a hematoma to the head. And he was laying face down with a letter in his hand, and it was a letter to the police department claiming his innocence, that he was not the Zodiac. And he actually had an interview scheduled with the police to go down and speak with them at the time of his death.
This nondescript file box in a San Francisco police crime lab contains the authentic letters from one of the country's most notorious killers, the Zodiac. We got a rare look at the original 30-year-old letters. Some in ciphers where the Zodiac taunted police, boasted of 37 killings, and incited fear.
He could write a letter. He had brilliant writing that just chilled the soul. Those letters are amazing documents.
Forensics documents examiner Susan Morton says handling photocopies doesn't bother her, but handling the original letters does.
Occasionally, we run into real evil, and this is evil.
The Zodiac movie by David Fincher came out, the one I've been referring to, and they all went and saw it at some point or another on their own. And they each individually realized that, oh my gosh, this could have been him. They got together and they started comparing notes. And they figured out that he had taken them, each of these places where the murders had occurred, he had taken them there prior to the murders happening there. It was like he was using these kids as his alibi, scapegoat, whatever. Like he was taking them out for play dates or whatever and using them so that he could scope out the areas where he wanted to do his business. So, of course, when all this came to pass, they realized that their older brother David had been right all along. And they all came back together. They made amends. And actually, 3 weeks after the documentary finished filming, David went into the hospital with cancer. And a week in the hospital and he died. They actually filmed in the hospital with Connie and Don there at his side, and they were talking about the fact that this was all he wanted. He knew something wasn't right, and he wanted everybody to believe him. It affected him his whole life, they said. So the kids go and tell the mom that she needs to watch the movie, and she refuses to see it. And she told the daughter, she said, everything I know about Mr. Allen will go to my grave with me. And the daughter was thinking, well, why would mom say that if she didn't feel like he was involved? Before David died, they went in and they found the box that the mother had referenced. They found many items, videotapes. It was a very odd videotape. It had all of his interviews with the different news stations. There was even a Geraldo episode on there about the case. It had some weird stuff on there. And then it went to Static, and he recorded a video to their mother. Her name was Phyllis, and he's talking to her in this video. He mentions to her that he wants to make sure his dog is taken care of after he died. Now, his dog's name was Sobe, and it was spelled S-O-B. I don't know if there's anything that you want to think about there with his dog's name. I don't know. I mean, you could, I guess, but he referenced a lot of letters that him and the mother had written back and forth to each other, and the kids found this huge notebook, 3-ring binder type thing, full of their letters back and forth with each other. And in there, it was kind of a confession. It was like they were connecting the dots. Because he makes a point to tell her, he's like, Phyllis, the killings at the lake, there was a witness. But the Zodiac was wearing a mask. The first letter that was mailed from San Francisco, it just happened to be that I got a speeding ticket in San Francisco that same day. My handwriting is similar to the Zodiac. But I just wanted to keep a low profile. So with all of that, they realized that they needed to dive deeper and deeper into the letters. And in reading the letters, they didn't go into huge detail on this. But one thing that did come out while all of this was going on was that there was a letter that was deciphered on a TV show. And yeah, the older brother David had seen it. The letter came from Albany, New York, and in the letter, it said, my next victim will be Connie Henley. Well, the daughter, her maiden name was Hensley. So it was all very similar. And around that same time, he had called on her. She didn't know he was in Albany, but he had called her and he goes, are you okay? And she goes, yeah. And he goes, he didn't like her husband. And he said, I'm going to come get you. And she goes, no, I'm fine. I'm good. You don't have to do that. Not long after that, she receives phone calls with somebody just breathing in the phone. They think it was him. She thinks it was him now that she's looking back on it.
There's a lot about Allen that matches. I agree with Grace Smith about that. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence. The problem is there's a lot of stuff that doesn't match.
Grace Smith acknowledges the handwriting doesn't match, although he thinks it's because Allen became a different personality as Zodiac. The elusive Zodiac boasted of killing 37 people, but authorities are convinced of only 5, the last a cab driver in San Francisco.
It's one of the all-time mysteries. This is right up there with Jack the Ripper.
Investigators just obtained enough DNA for a partial profile from the saliva on a lick stamp on one of the many letters the Zodiac sent in the late 60s, taunting police and bragging about his crimes. Investigators have now compared it to DNA from Arthur Lee Allen.
Our lab generated a DNA profile from his brain tissue and compared it to the partial DNA profile that we generated from the stamp, and they did not match.
Allen, a convicted child molester, lived for many years in Vallejo with his mother. Could she have licked the stamps for her son?
This DNA fingerprint belongs to a male.
A bloody fingerprint on the cab didn't match Allen's, or for that matter, anyone else's in a national data bank, and a palm print on a Zodiac letter didn't match Allen's or anyone else's. The Zodiac's writing also did not match Allen's. And now, this DNA analysis. Do you think then that he was not the Zodiac?
I think that it cast serious doubt on whether or not Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac.
But we're looking very carefully at the possibility that there was more than one person in this case. That's a possibility.
Graysmith says the Zodiac killer copied phrases, even his name, from movies, cartoons, and items popular in the 1930s. This is Charlie Chan in Treasure Island. When Arthur Lee Allen was a child, his father was in the Navy, stationed at Treasure Island.
He chose his whole modus operandi of chasing young couples by watery areas at night with a gun from the old Most Dangerous Game movie.
A year and a half after our interview, Lee Allen died of a heart attack at 58.
They were about to arrest him when he died.
Graysmith says there's enough circumstantial evidence against Lee Allen to make some veteran investigators believers. Allen sent me this handwritten and typed letter after our interview in 1991, calling me a friend. There was a Z on the envelope, similar to the one on an earlier letter believed to be from Zodiac. It began, "Dear Rita, please pardon the informality, but I consider you a friend."
I think that letter you got is a clue.
A clue because Zodiac author Robert Graysmith pointed out in that interview 5 years ago that Allen used a made-up word, professionality. Graysmith says that's similar to made-up words, obvious misspellings, and other oddities in the Zodiac letters. And the postmark on the envelope Allen sent me was July 30th, but the letter inside is dated after that, August 1st.
He lied about things he had no reason to lie about.
Was Arthur Lee Allen the Zodiac killer or a victim of years of police harassment? America's Most Wanted last week generated what Vallejo police tell me are, quote, 3 credible tips for further investigation. And 3 envelopes from the Zodiac's taunting letters now are being tested for DNA in the state crime lab. The case has new life.
He was teaching trampoline to those little girls over there, and I suspected it had to do with them.
He wanted to be a teacher. He liked a children's world. He liked kids. He liked to be a part of that world. To what extent, I didn't appreciate at the time.
He said he enjoyed listening to the screams of a child being beaten. He'd get even if he thought he'd been slighted or, something wrong. He was a very vindictive person.
Toschi told me these stories about Arthur Lee Allen, and I, as you know, the way that came about, I was visiting Toschi, and I said, I'd read this book on criminology, and they said, you know what, the guy who really did it will often try to help the police. And said, Dave, you've got 2,500 suspects. Did one of them ever try to help you, write you a letter? And Toschi says, yeah, I just got it. And it's from prison, and it's from Arthur Lee Allen. He says, I'm sorry it wasn't your man. I wish I could help.
He'd been fired from Valley Springs, and I know that he really sent a lot of resumes to get that job, and he liked it over there. And he got fired, and it looked like he wasn't going to teach anymore. I was concerned about what he was going to do, and I, went over there to kind of pep him up and talk to him about career choices and that sort of thing, and started asking him what he was going to do. And through some conversation, we got up to a point where he was talking about being a professional criminal. He didn't need a good resume for that. He could do it anyway. He said he would give himself an identity and write letters to the editors, and he'd have a name, and it would be Zodiac.